It was a cold-looking morning in late August 2016 when a family of 5 left their home in Sylvan, Victoria, and stepped into a kind of private, unravelling story that would sprawl across 1,000 kilometres and capture a country's attention. They left their phones, they left their passports, they left their doors unlocked and stacks of papers arranged almost deliberately throughout the house. And for nearly a week, Australia asked, what on earth happened to the Tromp family? I'm Leah Cartwright. This is Still Unanswered. Today, we're telling the Tromp family road trip story. Who they were, how a seemingly ordinary family left everything behind, how over a week they broke apart in ways that look both tragic and inexplicable, and what psychologists think might explain it. Dr. Erin Malek is here with me. Erin is a clinical psychologist and lecturer who's worked with cases involving shared psychosis, acute stress reactions, and complex family dynamics. Erin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Leah. It's an interesting case. Disturbing, really, but also important to look at carefully.
We'll start with the scene at the farm, because the small details matter. Picture a modest property in the Yarra Ranges. Berry rows, a red currant patch, some earth-moving equipment. Neighbours later said the Tromps were hard-working, quiet, ordinary. That's how the story begins, not with drama, but with normalcy. They left on August 29, 2016, Mark and Jacoba, the parents, with their 3 adult children, Rihanna, Mitchell and Ella. They set out in Ella's grey Peugeot SUV, and in the first hours of the trip, a rule was enforced. Phones stay behind. No passports, no credit cards, little trace.
Right. Which is, if you think about it, a very specific form of precaution. It's not just choosing to be offline for a day. It's an absolute rejection of traceability. And that in itself suggests a kind of targeted fear, whether reasonable or not. People concerned about privacy sometimes turn phones off. But to leave them, to remove passports and cards, there's a cognitive frame there that's significant.
Exactly. And early reporting suggests at least one phone was thrown from the car while they were driving. Witnesses later described the family as believing they were being followed or tracked. Phrases like, "we think someone's after us," or "they're tracking our phones," appear in coverage and in later interviews. The road trip begins as what they called a tech-free escape and ends as something much stranger.
The question I keep turning over is, what converts a tech-free idea into an absolute fearful avoidance? There are small steps in psychology that look like rational choices: privacy, protecting finances. When those choices are pushed to the extreme, it usually means a narrative has formed in someone's mind that frames technology not as a convenience, but as a weapon.
Let's walk the timeline. Day 1, they set out north. Within 24 hours, they're in or near Bathurst, about 800 kilometres from home. Reportedly, tensions rise. Mitchell, the 25-year-old son, leaves. He heads back to Melbourne, by train, by hitching, accounts vary. He later tells interviewers he felt his parents were too paranoid to be safe. He chose to leave them. That is the first fracture.
And that is a huge moment, Leah. When a family member chooses to physically separate, it's often the first crack in a shared narrative. Mitchell likely had more outside contact work, friends, so he could test the family's belief against broader reality. Usually in shared delusion cases, the more socially connected person is the first to step away.
After Mitchell leaves, the remaining 4 head toward the Jennelin Caves area. Remote, winding roads, lots of trees. The trip becomes more inconsistent. Reports describe arguing, turning back unexpectedly, and at one stage, the daughters, Rihanna and Ella, take action. Near Goulburn, they separate from their parents. The exact mechanics are fuzzy in different accounts, but what we do know is they split. One daughter ends up in Goulburn and will later be hospitalised. The other keeps moving south and will be involved in a stolen ute incident. It's as if the trip unspools physically at the same time as it unspools mentally.
You see patterns there that line up with both family systems dynamics and classic shared psychosis trajectories. The protective impulse, daughters taking car keys, attempting to get home, fits normal survival responses. It's not always that everyone is fully delusional. Sometimes people comply out of fear or loyalty, and later, when separated, recognize the implausibility of the belief and act to change course.
Let's be specific. Ella, 22, tries to get home. She's later found in the back of a local man's ute and charged with stealing that vehicle. She was terrified, confused. Witnesses didn't describe violence, more disorientation. Rihanna, 29, stays in or near Goulburn and is described as highly stressed and ultimately taken to hospital and treated in psychiatric care. Jacoba turns up in Yass in a distressed state and is also taken to hospital. And finally, Mark is found walking near Wangaratta Airport, dehydrated and disoriented. All 5 alive, but in very different places emotionally and legally. The trip ends, but the questions multiply.
And that's the central clinical question. How did this happen so quickly and so comprehensively? One explanation that's been widely discussed is folie à famille, shared psychosis within a family unit. It's a form of folie à deux extended to more family members. It's rare, but the features are present. One person develops a fixed persecutory belief, and those close to them come to share it, especially in isolated households with strong loyalty to an inducer.
Careful. I want to pause there, Erin. We have to be cautious about diagnosis. We're not psychiatrists treating these people, and the family's medical records are private. Publicly, there's no formal disclosure of a diagnosis. Rihanna did speak in 2017 and called the experience very scary, said they were trying to escape a situation, and emphasized embarrassment and a wish for privacy. So we're working from public behavior and published theory, not a clinical report. With that in mind, what does folie à famille look like in practice?
Good point, Leah. In practice, it often looks like a coherent narrative spreading within an enclosed group. One person, often the dominant family member, has a persecutory delusion. They interpret ordinary events as threats. Because family members depend on and trust them, they accept the narrative. The delusion can become reinforced. No external information contradicts it. When a member who's more connected to the outside breaks away, like Mitchell did, the group sometimes begins to fragment, and separation often leads to symptom reduction in the non-primary cases.
So Mitchell acts as the external tie. He leaves. The spell loosens for him. That must be terrifying. To decide to walk away from the people you love because their reality is becoming dangerous.
Absolutely. There's enormous ambivalence, guilt, fear, love. You're abandoning a family member who you may believe is genuinely threatened or believing they're ill. The calculus is painful. Mitchell's choice suggests he had enough outside reality testing to recognize the danger to himself or to the sanity of the group. It also tells us that not every family member carried the same strength of conviction.
Let's address alternative theories, because listeners always ask, what about toxins, egg chemicals, carbon monoxide, cults, extortion, criminal conspiracy. The public tossed out every option. Aaron, how did these stack up?
Toxin theories, pesticide exposure, carbon monoxide get floated in many puzzling cases, and they're worth considering. But they have limits. Toxins usually produce a range of physical and cognitive symptoms, not a single coherent persecutory narrative focused on being tracked by phones. Carbon monoxide, for example, can cause confusion and hallucination, but it tends to have a more diffuse cognitive impairment that affects motor coordination and awareness. A consistent, structured belief, they're following us via phones, reads more like a psychotic or paranoid frame than a purely toxic encephalopathy.
And the cult and criminal theories?
Those circulate because they're dramatic. But police reports and subsequent coverage didn't find evidence of organized extortion, cult ties, or criminal debts. That doesn't definitively rule them out. Some things are private, but the simplest fit with the evidence we have is psychological. Either an induced shared psychosis or an acute psychotic episode in one or two people with others reacting.
One of the most haunting images is the state of their house after police went back to Sylvan. Unlocked doors, keys left in vehicles, stacks of papers placed in odd ways, phones, passports, credit cards, all left behind. It looks at once like a hurried escape and a ritualized refusal of traceability. That combination, hasty but purposeful, creates a very particular story in the public imagination.
It does. From a clinician's perspective, you can interpret the paperwork and keys in several ways. It could be practical. They were gathering materials or trying to sort things and left in a panic. Or it could be symbolic. Leaving documents out, unlocking doors, leaving keys, gestures that say they're cutting themselves off. Symbolic acts often accompany delusional states. People enact their internal logic in the environment.
Let's talk about individual trajectories after the family separated. Rihanna, she later gave an interview. She said they were trying to escape a situation, but didn't want to elaborate. She was embarrassed and wanted to move on. Ella faced a charge for taking the ute, but insisted she was trying to get home and was deeply worried about her parents. Jacoba and Mark spent time in hospital. Publicly, none of them corrected the speculation into a neat answer. They guarded the private parts. Why would they keep silent?
Multiple reasons. Stigma around psychiatric conditions remains powerful, especially in rural communities and among people who view themselves as self-reliant, farmers, contractors. There's also legal and medical privacy. Being treated can mean non-disclosure. And there's emotional, shame, embarrassment, fear of being seen as weak. Finally, if the event is traumatic, they may not want to relive it in public forums. Rihanna's desire to be happy and healthy again is understandable. Public curiosity often feels like a re-traumatization.
That's a crucial point. We can be fascinated as a public while also causing harm. The media reaction at the time, some sympathetic, much sensational, framed it in headlines like bizarre road trip or family fleeing in fear. But there were also people who tried to humanize them, especially in later interviews. Still, once a family becomes a spectacle, it's hard to regain private life.
Yes, and sensational coverage can push families away from seeking help. If you think your story will be turned into a tabloid narrative, you may refuse public assistance or explanations. That makes gathering accurate public information harder. Clinically, that's one reason we rarely get perfect case studies. People want privacy, and rightly so.
We should also compare this to other documented cases of shared psychosis. There are historical examples, often smaller clusters or couples, but a whole family of 5? It's rarer, but not unheard of. The clinical literature emphasizes isolation, strong emotional bonds, and a charismatic inducer as risk factors. Mark, in many public readings, fits the inducer role. Head of household, business owner, person with authority and control over the family's narrative. But again, that's speculative.
Exactly. The inducer model is a hypothesis that fits the pattern, but it's not proof. Family dynamics matter a lot. Who has decision-making power? Who interprets risk? Who is socially connected outside the family? Those variables help explain why some family members hold the belief longer and others break away earlier.
I want to pause on one human image. Picture Mark walking near Wangaratta Airport, tired, dehydrated, alone. He's taken to hospital. The story ends publicly with him alive, not charged, being treated. To me, that's a quieter, sadder image than any sensational headline. It's a person who, whatever else happened, was clearly unwell and in need of care. Erin, what's the usual clinical next step after finding someone in that state?
Immediate care. Assess physical health, hydration, medication needs, and any acute psychiatric symptoms, delusions, hallucinations, agitation. If psychosis is suspected, a psychiatric assessment would follow. Treatment might include antipsychotic medication, therapeutic interventions, and, crucially, family-based care. In shared psychosis, separating the inducer from the induced can reduce symptoms in the latter. But longer-term work involves addressing the underlying vulnerabilities, stress, sleep deprivation, substance use, or underlying psychiatric illness.
Which raises another unanswered point. What was the trigger? Why August 29, 2016? The source material mentions stacks of business records. Could financial stress have been a precipitant? Or maybe a dispute, a letter, a legal notice? We don't know publicly. What do clinicians look for when trying to find a precipitating event?
We look for changes in routine, recent losses, legal or financial threats, traumatic events, increased substance use, sleep deprivation, anything that can increase stress load. Psychotic episodes are often precipitated by stress in vulnerable individuals. That might be economic worry, a fight, or even something mundane that gets misinterpreted into a threat narrative. In rural small business families, the intersection of financial strain, isolation, and 24/7 responsibility can create a large stress burden.
So, the absence of a smoking gun in public reporting doesn't mean there wasn't a trigger. It just means it's private, or subtle, or a slow burn. People crave a single dramatic cause, but sometimes the collapse is the result of years of stress hitting a tipping point.
Yes, and sometimes we'll never know because private medical records and the family's wishes prevent disclosure. That's ethically correct in most cases. People have a right to privacy, especially in matters of mental health.
Which brings us to an ethical question that should guide any publisher or podcaster. How do we tell this story without exploiting pain? We always try to foreground the family's humanity and avoid gratuitous speculation. We also avoid casual labels. They snapped is cheap. So in this episode, we've been trying to balance curiosity with caution. But listeners are going to want the biggest question answered. Did the family suffer a shared psychosis? Is folie famille the simplest explanation?
If I had to pick a parsimonious working hypothesis from the publicly available facts, I would say shared psychosis or an acute psychotic episode in the parents amplified by family loyalty and isolation, looks most plausible. The pattern, rapid onset, coherent persecutory beliefs centered on technology, the stepwise separation with symptom resolution in some members, fits that clinical picture. But remember, plausible is not proven. Without direct clinical records and interviews, we should regard it as a well-informed theory rather than a verdict.
And that, I think, is the tone people sometimes miss when this story is told elsewhere. There's a hunger for closure, something tidy to explain the strange behaviours, but the responsible way is to say, here's what we can see, here's what's likely, and here's what we don't know. Let's take a few of the open questions and riff on them.
Okay.
First, who or what did the Tromps think they were fleeing? Was it a specific person? A generalized fear of being tracked? The public received fragments. Fear of being followed? Phones used as trackers? Aaron?
The narrative seems to be a persecutory theme. Someone or some group is monitoring them. Whether they imagined a literal stalker, a government agency, or an unnamed they is unclear. In paranoia, the persecutor can be a concrete person or an amorphous force. Technology, phones, GPS, has become an easy focal point for persecutory delusions because it's invisible and it literally emits location data. So it's a psychologically plausible target for fear.
Second, why did different family members snap out of it at different times? Mitchell first, then the daughters, then the parents last. You've already touched on this, Aaron, but can we be more precise?
Different exposure to external reality, variation in personality and cognitive style, and sometimes the severity of symptom adoption. Mitchell likely had more outside contact, so more reality testing. The daughters were somewhere in the middle. They complied, then separated, and experienced relief or crisis followed by care. The parents, as the likely primary holders of the narrative, are last to release it because their identity and role may be bound up with the belief. Separation plus clinical intervention tends to reduce symptoms in those not suffering from an independent psychotic disorder.
Third, did the family receive long-term treatment, and are they at risk of recurrence? Publicly, we only know the immediate hospitalizations. One daughter did interviews and said they were working to get back on the farm. That's all we have. Aaron, from a clinical angle, what would long-term care look like?
Long-term care would ideally include psychological follow-up, psychological therapy for trauma, family therapy to address dynamics that allowed the delusion to spread, and social support, financial counseling if there are business pressures, community reintegration, and monitoring for relapse. If a primary psychotic disorder were present in a parent, ongoing medication and outpatient psychiatric care might be required. The risk of recurrence is tied to whether the initial episode was situational or chronic. If it was an acute stress-related episode and stresses are resolved, risk may decline. But there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
We mentioned the stolen ute incident involving Ella. The legal system. How does it usually handle acts committed while a person is clearly in distress? She was charged, but reporting suggested courts took the context into account. What happens there?
Courts often consider mental state. If someone commits an offense while in a severe mental health crisis, diversion to treatment rather than punitive measures is common. The precise outcome depends on jurisdiction and the judge. Public coverage suggested compassion, and that's consistent with how many systems respond when the circumstances are made clear. Treat the person, not just punish them.
There's a last layer I want to discuss. The cultural fascination with normal people snapping. Why are we so drawn to stories where ordinary lives fracture? Is it morbid curiosity or something else?
Part of it is threat simulation. We listen to stories of collapse to learn how to avoid it. Part is moral curiosity. How could a family so like ours end up in such a situation? But we also need to be careful. This fascination can edge into schadenfreude or pity that strips people of dignity. The ethical storyteller tries to satisfy curiosity while centering human vulnerability and avoiding sensationalist language.
We've been circling one more uncomfortable question. Did the media coverage itself worsen the family suffering? When they became national headlines, they lost privacy during the most vulnerable time. Aaron?
Yes, media attention can increase distress. In some cases, intense coverage can re-traumatize and make families less likely to seek help. It also encourages the public to fill gaps with speculation. That's why your earlier caution about not making definitive claims without records is so important.
We've reached the place in the episode where we try to reconcile the emotional arc with the facts. Here's what we know. The family left home on August 29th. They travelled over 1,000 kilometres. They separated in stages. 3 people received psychiatric care. 1 daughter was charged with taking a vehicle. The father was found alone and disoriented. Here's what we don't know: the exact trigger, the private medical details, and the inner narrative the family was convinced of when they fled.
And clinically, that's often enough for a working hypothesis: shared psychosis or an acute paranoid break in 1 or 2 primary members, amplified by family dynamics and isolation. But none of that removes compassion or the need for careful, non-judgmental language.
Before we close, Aaron, I want to ask a practical question for listeners who might be worried about someone in their life who's showing paranoid or delusional beliefs. What would you advise? How do you intervene without escalating things?
First, prioritize safety. If someone is a danger to themselves or others, call emergency services. If not, approach gently. You don't need to argue about the delusion. That usually fails. Instead, express concern. "I'm worried you seem unwell," and offer concrete help: a doctor's appointment, a ride, or sitting with them while they call a clinician. Keep calm, avoid confrontational language, and keep lines of contact open. Social support and practical help can make it easier for someone to accept treatment.
That's simple and humane. As we wrap up, the Tromp family road trip remains uncomfortable and unresolved in many ways. The public narrative favours mystery and sensational labels, but the likely explanation, the one that best fits the evidence without leaping to judgment, is a psychological collapse of some kind, perhaps a shared psychotic episode triggered by stress in an isolated family. But the family's privacy and the lack of public clinical records mean we'll never have a tidy, satisfying answer.
And that's okay. Part of responsible storytelling is accepting ambiguity and using it to teach about mental health, about care, about the way speculation can harm. The facts point us in a direction, and that direction asks for empathy more than spectacle.
In the months after the trip, Rihanna spoke about the family's embarrassment and their wish to just get back to farming and to be happy and healthy. Maybe that's the final note we should hold, not the scandal, but the human desire for ordinary peace. Aaron, thank you for grounding this with care and restraint.
Thanks for having me, Leah, and thanks for the sensitivity. These stories need it.
We'll leave a list of public sources in the episode notes for anyone who wants to read more news reports, interviews, and features that covered the road trip as it unfolded. If you're someone listening who's dealing with unusual worries, paranoia, or sudden changes in a loved one, reach out. There are clinicians, community health services, and crisis teams who can help. We'll put some resources in the show notes. This episode of Still Unanswered was researched and written by me, Leah Cartwright. Dr. Erin Malek joined me as a guest. If you have memories or thoughts about the Tromp family story, if you knew the family or were in those towns at the time and want to contribute context, please contact us respectfully. We are intentional about preserving privacy and dignity in any contributions. Thank you for listening. Next week, another case that resists a neat explanation. Until then, be gentle with one another. Still Unanswered is produced in Melbourne. Music and technical credits are in the episode notes. Good night.